but this is the third and the last session on Moses. So I'll just recap for a few seconds so that you'll remember what we've done before. The first two sessions were about the kind of man that Moses was. First, we looked at how God made known his ways unto Moses and his acts unto the children of Israel. And that's Psalm 103 and verse 7. And then we discovered in the second session that Moses didn't just know about God, but he knew him. He knew his character. He knew his ways and how he did things. He knew God intimately. That's Exodus 33, verses 12 to 17. He knew him. He wanted God's presence more than anything else. He wanted it not just for himself, but for the whole Israelites, the whole nation of Israel. And today, I want us to look at how God made Moses the man that he was. When you look at the whole life of Moses, you find that it is split into three parts. 3 40-year parts. And we're going to take a quick look at these 3 40-year periods. And the first 40-year period is his time spent in Egypt. Acts chapter 7. The scriptures come from Acts this morning. Acts 7 verses 20 to 22. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months, he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Moses was born when persecution of Israel was at its hottest. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and Pharaoh had given orders for all the baby boys to be killed. Moses' parents kept him safe for 3 months. And when they daren't keep him any longer, they put him in a basket and they coated it with tar and pitch so that it was waterproof. And then they put him among the reeds along the banks of the Nile. And then Pharaoh's daughter came and she found him and she took him in and brought him up as her own son. So he became a prince in Egypt. And verse 22 tells us he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Philo, a Jewish philosopher, tells us he was taught maths, chemistry, engineering, architecture, astronomy, poetry, philosophy, music, and the religion of the Egyptians. We're not taught those things, but Moses was. Wow. And he was also a military leader in his early years. So he wasn't a Dumbo. He really wasn't a Dumbo. He could have passed his GCSEs. He had the best education that Egypt could offer him. He had the best of everything. Yet, he was in a desert. Maybe not a real desert, not a natural desert, but he was in a desert, a symbolic one. He didn't fit in. He was like a square peg in a round hole. He didn't really belong with the Egyptians. He'd been taken from his natural mother and father and all his family, from his own people and the faith that they had in the one true God. And he was brought up in strange surroundings. But deep, deep within him, a desire began to form to help his own people. Surely, now the time was right to step in on their behalf and do something. He had the political clout. He had the military knowledge. He had physical gifting and a deep sympathy that was beginning to grow and get stronger for his people. Surely he's ready. He's spent 40 years in Egypt training for this. Surely now is the time. But no. God had different plans. Acts chapter 7 verses 23 and 24 tells us that Moses saw an Egyptian who was ill-treating one of the Israelites, and he steps in and kills him. He thought the Hebrew would be glad that Moses had stepped in, and all the rest of the people would back him in his fight to set them free. But they didn't. In verse 25 of Acts 7, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but it says they did not. They didn't. And on top of that, Exodus chapter 2 verse 15 tells us that Pharaoh heard about it. He heard what Moses had done and he wanted to kill him. So Moses ran away. He was fearful for his life. And he ran away to a place called Midian, which was in a real desert. And he was 40 years old when he ran away. So the second 40-year period of his life is his time spent in Midian. Acts chapter 7 and verses 29 and 30. When Moses heard that Pharaoh wanted to kill him, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Sinai. In Midian, Moses met Jethro, a descendant of Abraham, and he was a priest of Midian. And Moses married one of Jethro's daughters called Zipporah, and he worked as a shepherd for Jethro. And because he married into Jethro's family, he would learn all the traditions of Israel. And most likely, because Jethro was a priest, he got to know about God in a more personal way. But you know, Going from the luxury of a royal palace to working as a shepherd in the desert really must have been a humiliating experience for him. In fact, in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, it says, "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth." In Egypt, he'd learned how to rule. And although he'd felt the stirring of sympathy for his own people and the beginning of a desire to see them released from their slavery, it was mixed with selfishness, pride, and ambition. And now, in this real desert, serving Jethro, he learned quite a few things, several things. He learned first humility. Exodus 2 verses 16 and 17, right at the beginning, before he'd met Jethro, it says, "A priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. And some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock." He rescues Jethro's 7 daughters from harassment from the other shepherds, and then he even waters their flock for them. He didn't need to water them because they'd done it all their life probably, but Moses did it for them. He went beyond the call of duty and he stooped down to do their work for them. Can you imagine the Prince of Egypt actually watering livestock? And he had to learn other things. He had to learn to take orders from Jethro, who he worked for, instead of giving them. And he learned contentment. Exodus 2 verse 21, "And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter." Now remember, Moses had just come from a royal palace. He'd had servants waiting on him, hand and foot. Luxury was the norm. For 40 years, he'd been in that luxury and enjoyed everything it offered. Manual labour was looked down on for royalty. But despite that, this verse tells us he was content to live with the man. He didn't complain about living in a tent instead of a palace. He didn't complain about lack of servants or not having a daily bath because he lived in the desert in a tent. He was completely content. He was ready and willing to make his home there. He would have to spend lots of time alone with just his sheep for company. And he had to learn the art of being still and endurance and waiting and listening for God to speak. And he would also have to learn practical things, such as where water and food were to be found for his sheep to survive, and also how to protect them from predators and keep them safe. And that would be quite difficult at times because sheep have a tendency to wander off in all kinds of directions. They'll follow anything. And eventually, after 40 years in the real desert, learning all these things, he actually meets God at the burning bush. And by this time, he was 80 years old. And it's still in the desert. He's still in the desert, but he meets God in the desert at the burning bush. And that brings us to the last 40 years of Moses' life. And again, it's still in the desert. And it's his time in the desert with the Israelites. Acts 7 verses 33 and 34 says, "Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals. The place where you are is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free." And God says, now come. I will send you back to Egypt. At 80 years old. At this point, I want to tell you, and I tell myself, there is no retirement in God's eyes. At 80 years old, God commissions him to go back into Egypt and speak to Pharaoh. And God says, and bring my people out of Egypt. He'd spent 80 years being trained by God to be able to fulfill the call that God had put on him. Now he's ready. He's ready. And he led Israel out of slavery, and he organized them into a nation and gave them God's laws. He taught them to know and follow God. But, and it's a big but in Moses' life, but it took another 40 years for Moses to actually get them to the edge of the promised land and ready to possess it. And at that point, after another 40 years in the desert, he passed the mantle on to someone else, Joshua. And Moses died at the age of 120. And he died at the top of Mount Pisgah in the desert, still in the desert when he died. D.L. Moody, who was an American evangelist in the 1800s and formed the Moody Bible Institute, said Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody. 40 years learning he was nobody. And 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. So Moses really spent all his life in a desert situation. And look what he achieved with God. We grumble if we spend a day in a desert or a wilderness experience or a few days. We grumble, and all we want to do is really get out of it. All we can think about is, oh Lord, help me. Please help me. Get me out of this situation. Do something for me. We don't like it when we're in a desert situation. It's not nice. It's really not nice. And I believe that Moses' experiences in the desert can be such an encouragement to us when we go through a bad time, because God is still working and fulfilling his purposes, even though we feel in a dry and a very barren spiritual state. You see, God allows us to go through desert experiences for a reason. Just like he did it with Moses. He tests us and he teaches us and he develops our character, just like he did with Moses and the Israelites. In Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 2, Moses tells the Israelites to remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. And God may test us and teach us things, and it may be hard. It may be very hard at times, but he never leaves us and he never forgets us. The Israelites must have wondered many times if God had forgotten them in Egypt. Exodus 2 verses 23 and 24 says, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God, and God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. God never forgets his promises. If God has made promises to you, he will fulfill them. He will keep them. He never forgets his promises. He's working his purposes out, even in the wilderness and the desert. You know, even Jesus had a wilderness experience, which prepared him for his ministry. Luke chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan, where he was baptized, and led by the Spirit into the desert, where for 40 days, another 40, he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them, he was hungry. Being in a wilderness experience doesn't necessarily mean that you've done something wrong or you're in the wrong place. Jesus was full of the Holy Spirit and led by the Spirit into the desert. I want us to really get hold of this because I think it's so important. God, by his Spirit, can woo us into the desert. Hosea chapter 2 and verse 14, God is speaking to Israel through Hosea and says, therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. He does it because he loves us and he wants to speak to us. A wilderness experience has no time span. It can last a few hours or a few days 40 days, 40 years, 120 years, like Moses, if we live that long. It lasts as long as it takes for God to do what he wants to do in us. So, to close, when next time we feel in a dry wilderness experience, or if we're in one right now, this morning, and you feel so far away from God and you feel he's forgotten you, let's remember Moses and how God formed him in the desert. Let's remember that God is still working in us, even in the desert. And he will never leave us or forget us. Let's not be impatient to get out of the wilderness like we normally are, but let's be humble and content and be still in it and allow God to do what he wants with us. Allow him to be God. Allow him to make us the person that he wants us to be.